There we go. And that's why we're in our series, The Wisdom of Solomon. All right? All right? So, we have a couple of follow-up courses to this sermon series. We have a follow-up course that starts this Wednesday. We have a normal Bible study, but we also have the course called Financial Freedom, which is like the biblical foundation for finances and like the how to get out of debt class, okay? So that's that class. Then on Thursdays, we have starting this Thursday, we have a class called Money and Wealth 101. It will be meeting at El Centro at 7 o'clock on on Thursdays. And that's a different kind of a class. That is, okay, I'm receiving an income, what am I supposed to do with it? Like, how am I supposed to use this thing that I have? Am I just supposed to go buy snacks with it, or what? So it's that idea, but it's actually the whole wealth building process. Now, I was supposed to preach this last Sunday. I was coming back from travels with my wife, and we've been married just about to be married 33 years, and so. To each other, same people, okay, just to be clear. But I threw my back out, and so Pastor David stepped in for me last Sunday, which was great. I heard he just had like a whole comedy routine up here. It was great. So, and then Pastor Jesse the week before. So I just wanted to say thanks to Pastor Jesse, Pastor David for the last couple of weeks. But you're like, oh, Pastor Kurt, you hurt your back. It's so sad, so sad. Don't feel too bad. It was actually caused by a beach chair. And what I mean by that, I was in Nassau, Bahamas, and I leaned over to move the beach chair. Beach chairs are not significantly heavy objects, right? So I leaned, and I just snapped my back, just like that. So don't feel too bad. It was a beach chair injury. I was on a beach. I did not shovel one bit of snow during the snowstorm, just so you know, so you don't have to feel too bad. So back to this Wisdom of Solomon series. It's a financial series, and we've learned that he was the wisest man in history and the wealthiest man of his generation. And so far, we have learned that he initially started on the right path. He had the right posture towards God, the correct fear of the Lord. This unleashed the wisdom of God in his life, and this opened up the wealth into Solomon's life as well. The purpose of this wealth that God was providing for him, we discovered, was for Solomon to build the most magnificent temple of God and for the establishment of systems of justice. Then we learned that wisdom creates financial margin, it creates increased value, and manages time and risk. Now, today is a whole different kind of financial lesson that we learn from Solomon. In fact, it's the warning sermon. It's because it's based on the life of Solomon. The life of Solomon is not a life that we're simply supposed to follow. It's a life that is exposed plain in the Bible for us to discern and learn from. Sometimes, some things we're supposed to embrace from Solomon's life, and other things we're supposed to recognize as deeply problematic and must be avoided at all cost. It's like a parent who tells their child about a couple of the mistakes they made from their past. The parent is not trying to encourage their child to recreate the same stupid mistakes. They're encouraging them to not repeat the same stupid mistakes. That's what they're doing. And that's what the Bible does so often, is it tells us the whole story, not just part of it. So we're going to start here with this first idea, which is the common sense of security. The common sense of security. In ancient national struggles and military conflicts, horses and chariots were military weapons. Think about it. It was a long time ago, and horses and chariots were a big deal. The army with the most horses would normally win the battle that they were in. Think of the horses and chariots like modern tanks. So they would have the strongest tanks and they would win the battle. Now Solomon, King Solomon, the king of Israel, was really good with building wealth, and it turns out he was really, really good at building a strong military. In 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 26, we see this. It says, Solomon built up a huge force of chariots and horses. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horses. How many horses? 12,000. He stationed some of them in the chariot cities near him in Jerusalem. And if you go to Israel with me at some point in the future, one of the places we'll stop is a place where Solomon used to keep his horses. You can see the stables still. Verse 28, it says, Solomon's horses were imported from Egypt. For those of you familiar with the Bible, that should give you pause. Solomon's horses were imported from Egypt. Further on, it says they were then exported to the kings of the Hittites and the kings of Aram. So I want you to let it sink in. Solomon, the king of Israel, had at this point established trading relationships with Egypt. In case you had forgotten, Egypt is the country that used to keep Jews in slavery for over 400 years. In order to build wealth, Solomon made political and economic alliances with Egypt. He did this to gain multinational favor and to build the most significant military force in the region. But step back from his military and political and financial genius for a moment. He had a father, and Solomon's father was named David, as in King David, as in the David, a man after God's own heart, as in David and Goliath David. He took out the giant Goliath. In fact, when David was getting ready to take out the Goliath giant, he said in 1 Samuel, "The Lord saves not with sword and spear. This is the Lord's battle, and he will give you to us." That's what David said. When David was young, he had an intimate relationship with God, and he trusted God. He killed the giant with a stone instead of a massive military force. His trust was in the Lord. Now, compare that in your thinking to the thinking of his son Solomon. Who was Solomon trusting in? But it's more pronounced because the first story about David and Goliath is when David was young, but older King David, when David became the king, he wrote this, Psalm 20. "Some nations boast of their chariots and horses, but we," meaning Israel, "we boast in the name of the Lord our God." Some trust in their horses and chariots, but we trust the name of the Lord our God. When David was king, his heart was bent towards dependence on God. So David openly declared the greatness of God and his nation's entire dependence on God. And in this song, he's lightly mocking the other nations. He's mocking them for needing to rely on horses and chariots. He's mocking the other nations' desire for military buildup because Israel has God. Israel has the God above all the gods and the King above all kings who controls the armies of heaven, and the armies of heavens are on their side. That's what David is saying. He's boasting of the goodness of God. It's like he's saying, hey, you got yourself a fancy horse and chariot. Well, I got a slingshot and the big guy. Now, let's be brutally honest for a second. It takes a massive amount of trust and dependence on God to authentically let God fight your battles. Some might look at the military strategy of a nation who decided they were just going to be reliant and dependent upon an unseen God to fight their battles as well, just ridiculous. Because what happens if another nation attacks us? It doesn't make any sense to not have a military. What happens if they surprise us and try to take our stuff? It's our stuff. It doesn't make any sense to let God be in charge of our stuff because they can't see him. What if they try to burn our crops and starve us to death? It doesn't make any sense to not have a military force to be reckoned with. It's just common sense to have security. It's just common sense to have a big military. But King David knew differently, and he trusted the Lord. In those moments of his life, he honored the direct and clear instructions of God, who had previously established rules for kings. Maybe you didn't know this, but the Bible tells the kings of Israel exactly how to behave and what they're supposed to do. They generally did a really bad job at it. But this is why David had such confidence in his strategy to not trust in horses and chariots, but to trust in the Lord their God. Because in Deuteronomy chapter 17, which we'll refer back to a few times today, it says, "You are about to enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, when you take it over and settle there." 16, "The king must not build a large stable of horses for himself and send his people to Egypt to buy horses. For the Lord has told you, you must never return to Egypt." Somebody say it. Never return to Egypt. Amen. So the kings of Israel were forbidden to ever buy horses from Egypt. Amen. This was a mandate straight from God. David knew it, so did Solomon. Not to rely on their military power, but that they should and could rely entirely upon God to fight their battles. The intent was not for Israel to defend itself, but for God to defend Israel. So if the nations came after him, it didn't matter. God would take care of it. In other words, this nation was a nation that God himself was trying to build. The king was chosen by God, and he was required by Deuteronomy to abide by certain rules. These people of God were not to be a nation bent on war and destruction and power, relying upon their own strength, relying upon their own power. And if you know the rest of the story, it lets us know that they did in fact choose to rely on themselves instead of God. And their reliance on themselves instead of God is in fact what destroyed them. You see, you're never supposed to go back to Egypt. You're never supposed to go trade with Egypt. And somebody hearing this today needs to understand that you need to start letting God fight your battles. You need to follow the clear directions and instructions of God, because right now you are using earthly and worldly battle strategies, and it's destroying your soul. You've been collecting horses and chariots, and the horses have started to trample you to death. You need to drop to your knees and surrender and to begin to let God fight for you. Because if God is for you, then who can be against you? So, although Solomon was full of wisdom, the wisest man in history, and even though his father had not trusted in horses and chariots, and even though God clearly commanded him, specifically as the king of Israel, not to send his people to Egypt to buy horses, because the Lord had told him, you must never return to Egypt, Solomon still became enamored by the trinkets, the treasures, and the trophies of the world. You see, Egypt is where the best horses in the world were bred. He had to have the best. It wasn't too many years before this, Israel had escaped Egypt. They were slaves for centuries. So in order to buy horses from Egypt, they would have to create an alliance with their former slaveholders. Solomon made them allies with their former oppressors, even though God had already told them, don't ever return to Egypt. Never return to Egypt. God had already gotten them out of Egypt, and he was still, all these years later, still trying to work on getting the Egypt out of them. The point here is this: you don't negotiate with your former slaveholders. You don't make alliances with your former oppressors. If there is something that used to hold you in bondage, then do not play with it. When the slaveholders come to trade with you, to create an alliance with you, maybe it's an old flame, maybe it's an old friend, maybe it's an old way of thinking, maybe it's an old Facebook picture from 15 years ago that suddenly entices you back to go back to Egypt. Don't make allies, you know what I'm talking about clearly, but don't make allies with your former slaveholders. Never return to Egypt. There's so many but Pastor Kurt's that people say to that. Just don't ever return to Egypt. There's an interesting teaching that Jesus gives in Luke 11. It says, when an evil spirit leaves a person, it goes into the desert searching for rest. But when it finds none, it says, I will return to the person I came from. So it returns and finds that its former home is swept and in order. Then the spirit finds 7 other spirits more evil than itself, and they all enter the person and live there. And so the person is worse off than before. It's an interesting story by Jesus. Make sure that when you leave something or give up something or overcome something in your life, when you are delivered of something in your life, that you immediately begin to occupy that new space with the Spirit of God. That you put a sign to the enemy that says, we do not negotiate with slaveholders, and you are not permitted entrance. So when Egypt comes and wants to trade with you, rebuke, resist, and run. When Egypt comes knocking at your door, rebuke, resist, and run. When the picture pops up, rebuke, resist, run, and delete. All right? There you go. Our friend Frank, who was part of the church, who passed away a few years ago, he, in his earlier life, had helped start a notorious and deeply problematic biker club. And 40 years pass, and the 40-year anniversary of this biker club happens, and they reach out to Frank to try to get him back to come back to celebrate the 40-year anniversary. They try to take him back to Egypt. Frank wisely responded, I'm not that guy anymore. I won't be coming. I'm not that guy anymore. And it's really important to remember when Egypt comes knocking, who you have become. I'm not that guy anymore. I'm not that gal anymore. That's the end of the story. I don't have to explain anything after that. So back to Solomon. His economic trading strategy, it made sense. His political strategies made sense. His military defense strategy, it made sense. It seemed prudent. It even seemed wise. It was common sense security. Economically wise, common sense, but spiritually foolish. Egypt came calling, and Solomon went back. Let me talk to you about the common sense of political alliances as well. In ancient political practice, it was common practice in the era for a king to marry the daughter of another nation's king or a royal from that nation. And that would create a promise of peace. It would create an economic alliance. It would give the king an ally in case there was war with another country. In ancient politics, it's the way it worked, and it made sense to everybody involved. So Solomon is leading the nation. He's building the temple of God. He's establishing a massive military. It's common sense political alliances. And I want you to notice what we just did there. He's building the temple of God. So he's doing what he's supposed to do right alongside the things he's not supposed to do. So 1 Kings chapter 11. Now King Solomon loved many foreign women. Now we could just let that live right there, right? King Solomon loved many foreign women, besides Pharaoh's daughter. Just that should hit you, because who is Pharaoh's daughter? The daughter of the Pharaoh of Egypt. He married women from Moab and Ammon and Edom and Sidon, and from among the Hittites. The Lord clearly instructed the people of Israel, You must not marry them because they will turn your hearts to their gods. Yet Solomon insisted on loving them anyway. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, and in fact, they did turn his heart away from the Lord. I know you couldn't get past the 700 wives. That wasn't the most important part of that verse, okay? We'll get back to it. Just to make sure you're following, earlier, we have extremely clear direction from God, again, for kings. Deuteronomy 17. The king must not take many wives for himself. Apparently, many doesn't mean the same thing to everybody. Because they will turn his heart away from the Lord. So Solomon was just going at this point. You have to figure this out here. Solomon at this point is just going to do whatever he thought was best. Whatever made sense to him. Whatever made sense to other nations. Because this was the way to retain power in the ancient world. It just made sense. And God strictly forbids it. You see, the king and kingdom that God establishes is not supposed to behave like other nations. It's not supposed to behave like the heathen and pagan kings around. The king of Israel was supposed to be set apart because the people of God are to be the great hope for all peoples of the world. And you can't be the great hope of all the peoples of the world if you're just like everybody else. But this can only happen if the king of Israel is nothing like the pagan and heathen kings that surround them. And it's a great lesson for all of us today. We should not strive to be like the pagan and heathen influences and influencers around us. Our goal in our life should be to be a beacon of hope in a dark place and healers in a broken world. Our desire should be to let God raise us up as authentic servants and leaders in a place that is desperate for godly examples. See, we live in a time when nearly everything that makes sense to people is fundamentally harmful to people. But this is impossible to do if your goal is to fit in and be like everybody else. We are called by God to be holy, not legalistic, to be holy. This isn't about rules, it's about righteousness. So does anybody want to be holy? Because if you do, then you won't talk like you used to and you won't walk like you used to. Does anybody want to be righteous? Then you're going to be living in this strange tension in life where there's all these things at your feet and within your grasp that just make sense. And yet, even though they make sense, you need to simply walk over them and keep on moving. We aren't called to be people that make sense. We are called to be holy and righteous and reliant upon God, raised up to be a blessing to all the nations and all the peoples of the world. Man, if you start to think, wow, I really agree with that person here from this world's point of view, you are in the wrong state of mind. What Solomon did, it was economically wise. Militarily, it made sense. It was politically savvy, made sense. But it was 100% spiritually foolish and would ultimately lead to the most crushing of defeats and disappointments in his family and in his nation that we still live with the consequences of today. He chose common sense economically and politically, all at the expense of his first love, his relationship with God. And that takes us to a verse we read earlier, and it's one of the top 10 most terrifying verses in the Bible. 1 Kings chapter 11, at the end there, it said, in fact, they did turn his heart away from the Lord. If your heart has been turned away from the Lord, nothing else in your life matters. The wisest man in the whole world tasked by God to build the greatest temple and the brilliant systems of justice. He did indeed build the temple and the halls of justice, and yet still his heart became corrupted. He did part of what he was supposed to do. It's an interesting idea that we can convince ourselves that because we're doing some of what God told us to do, it's okay to not do the other things God has told us to do. That's just called being a human. That's human common sense right there. There's also this third thing, which is the common sense of taking a cut. Taking a cut. Earlier, when Solomon had asked God for wisdom, God told him that he would also give him wealth. The wealth was supposed to be used to build magnificent temple and the systems of justice. And if you want to read the story of the temple, it's 1 Kings chapter 5, 6, 7, and 8. You can read the account of building the temple. But inside of this story, you will see something, a couple of little interesting nuggets. Chapter 7, verse 1, it says, Solomon also, just pay attention to that word also, he also built a palace for himself. It took him 13 years to complete the construction. Pay attention. How long did it take? 13 years. That had to be a pretty serious palace for himself. I mean, it doesn't take 13 years to build most things. 13 years to build a palace. And at first glance, it might not seem like a big deal. He was the wealthiest man of his generation. He probably needed a lot of room for all those horses and chariots. Not to mention, he had 700 wives, 300 concubines, and a whole bunch of kids probably. He needed a big old palace. It was a massive undertaking that involved all kinds of financial excess. It was magnificent, perhaps too magnificent. Well, track with me now. How long did it take him to build himself a palace? 13 years. How long does it take him to build the temple of God? Well, I didn't read that part yet, but let me go back. 2 verses earlier, in the end of chapter 6, verse 37 and 38, the foundation of the Lord's temple was laid in mid-spring in the month of Ziv during the 4th year of Solomon's reign. The entire building was completed in every detail by mid-autumn in the month of Bul during the 11th year of his reign. So it took 7 years to build the temple. 7 for God, 13 for me. There's a difference. The narrator of 1 Kings did this on purpose. He put these 2 sentences back to back. When you and I read the Bible today, they've chopped up the Bible into like chapters and verses, and so you go to end of chapter, maybe one day you're reading 1 Kings chapter 6, you put it away because you finished, the next day you start with chapter 7, you forgot how chapter 6 ended. But when it was originally written, it just flowed. There was no chapters and there was no verses. So the narrator puts these 2 sentences back together. So it took 7 years to build the temple. It took him 13 years to complete his palace. He's telling you, without calling it out directly, he's telling you Solomon lost his way. Solomon's heart had become divided and unloyal. He openly has rejected the sovereignty of God, and he's building his own military. He begins to see himself as the highest authority. I got God a palace, I'm going to get myself a palace. He is slowly and gradually having his heart turned away from God because Solomon is becoming his own God. He's spent more time and likely far more money on his own house than on God's house. He had come to see himself as the highest authority. He was now his own king of all kings. This is a problem. 1 Kings 10:14, each year Solomon received about 25 tons of gold. Just so you know, that's $4 billion every single year. For himself. This did not include the additional revenue he received from merchants and traders, all the kings of Arabia, and the governors of the land. Not $4 billion in his lifetime, $4 billion a year. The narrator is making an assumption that the readers of the story of Solomon already know the rules for kings that kings are supposed to follow. So when Solomon gets the horses and chariots, you're supposed to read that and go, oh, he's not supposed to do that. When he collects all kinds of wives, including the Egyptian princess, the reader is supposed to be getting upset at this wise man who is acting the part of a fool. When he takes nearly twice as long to build a palace for himself as he did for God, and collecting $4 billion a year for his personal gain, they already know that the rules say in Deuteronomy 17 that kings must not accumulate large amounts of wealth in silver and gold for themselves. It's like Solomon read Deuteronomy 17 and said, all the things I'm not supposed to do, that's exactly what I'm going to do. We are supposed to hear the warning to not let the things of this earth turn us from God. The story of Solomon is complicated. I oftentimes think, this is supposed to be in the Bible? It's so problematic. He was just such a complicated person. You see, it made sense to him to build the military. It made sense to him to create the political alliances. It made sense to him to go ahead and use all the wealth around him for his own pleasures. Didn't he, after all, deserve a cut of it? He was doing God's work. Entirely missing his call to be a blessing to all the nations of the world. He was the wisest man in the world, but he was also foolish. He was the wisest man ever. And because he was the wisest man ever, one could make the case that he is also the most foolish man in all of human history. He played the fool. He chose luxury over faithfulness. He chose personal fame over the glory of God. He chose power over faith. He chose the natural over the supernatural. These laws of Deuteronomy for Solomon made it clear that the king of Israel was not the final authority, but he was supposed to be an authority underneath God. Solomon, it turns out, forgot who he really was. That's something we can relate to. It's easy to forget who you really are. Now, just to make sure you don't miss this, it wasn't a command for kings to be poor or even against building wealth, but against large amounts of gold and silver for himself. Let me talk about this. First of all, kings were kings until they died. So in reality, they would have everything they needed for all of their life. It was entirely unnecessary for them to even attempt to build wealth. And this is really speaking to the grotesque use of God's resources for personal pleasure. As a king, you have people to take care of. And so God's saying, hey, don't use up all the resources on yourself. I'm giving you stuff for you to take care of people. And in your life, you might struggle with this as well. And this is a question that particularly here in America that we need to answer and wrestle with. It's this idea of how much is enough. And everybody's going to have a slightly different answer to this. And it's a question, though, that you need to ask yourself, how much is enough? What if? Would that be enough? Or would I keep on wanting more? Because that's what happens if you don't know the answer to how much is enough, is you get to enough and then you keep on building bigger silos to build bigger silos. It's a constant tension that we have between sacred investment versus self-expansion. Solomon failed at this, but the truth is most of the kings failed at this. So let's learn from both the wise parts of Solomon and the foolish parts of Solomon. There were good things and there were bad things. So let's do the good things and not do the bad things as the worship team comes up. God was setting the stage in these declarations about what kings are supposed to do. because God was trying to set up a time in the future when there would be one true king that would show up. A humble king, one that would one day come whose kingdom would have no end, whose kingdom would change everything, whose king would bring peace to all the nations. The prophet tells us in Zechariah, look, your king is coming to you. He is righteous and victorious, yet he is humble, riding on a donkey, riding on a donkey's colt. I will remove the battle chariots from Israel and the war horses from Jerusalem. I will destroy all the weapons used in battle, and your king will bring peace to the nations. His realm will stretch from sea to sea and from the Euphrates River to the ends of the earth. Solomon wasn't going to be that king that we needed. But God knew that there was a king coming that we would all need. We have King Jesus. And can I tell you today that I look forward to that day when King Jesus will come and finally bring peace to all the nations, where all the weapons on the planet will be destroyed, where lions will lie down with lambs, and his rule will reign forever and ever and ever. Would you stand with me? Would you stand with me? Solomon didn't do it for us, but Jesus did. So today, keep your heart passionately in love with Jesus. Don't forget your first love. It's okay to build resources, but remember, you build the resources for His purposes. And make sure that you put yourself in a position to always be reliant upon God. Rely on God. As the worship team closes us, the altars are open. Let's spend some time responding to that.